A few years ago, said to myself, now I'd like to try to understand what this Chinese system, the political system, is like. What is it up to? How does it work? What is it for? And the conclusions I've drawn from that are entirely bleak and despondent. And I've come to the view that the best we can hope for in the Chinese political system is a continuation of today's hard dictatorship, which is nevertheless tempered by an element of pragmatism. That, I think, is the best we can hope for. There are other possibilities, but for the most part, they are even worse. And I'll return to that as we go along. So what I found is that this Chinese system, the People's Republic of China today, is entirely unique and different from anything else anywhere, now or in history. It's entirely of its own kind. And I stress this when I talk about it, that this is a different kind of animal. We have not seen this before. The political system is unique. It's a party state. That's not just a one-party state, but a party state with all the parallel bureaucracies that work to reinforce each other. And it is, as a party state, highly effective. There are now only 4 or 5 party states left in the world, and China is unique in being the big one and in being very, very effective. Its dictatorship is unique. So smooth now that in some respects it does not even look dictatorial. It is able to rely extensively on people's self-control. It's a dictatorship of a new kind. I give it a name since it's of a separate kind. I call it a controlocracy. That term is not as bad as you think. If you practice it a little bit, it works very well. A controlocracy. A system dedicated to control and very effective in doing it. Its economy is unique. It is exactly what the leaders say it is. It's a socialist market economy, not capitalist, not a crude command economy, and it is, as we know, effective. Its system of corruption is unique. It's not a sideshow of bribery, but an integral part of the political economy in the form of organized crime against the state from within the state and on a big scale. So this is like nothing the world has ever known, and standard terms like capitalist, socialist, even autocratic have little meaning. It needs to be understood entirely on its own terms. However, how unique and sophisticated this system is, it still has at its core an awkward crudeness that is common to all dictatorships. When all the glitter of economic growth, city skyscrapers, high-speed rail and all that is peeled away, China is a dictatorship, raw, repressive and brutal. It is a system in which people of independent mind cannot sleep at ease at night out of fear that someone will come and take them away and bring retribution down upon those who are near to them, and in which those who stand in its way and those around them do get crushed. Now, I followed in preparing this book and in writing it, this meeting ground between the stability maintenance bureaucracy and those who stand in its way, on the raw edge, closely. And I then have seen some regularities which I think are shocking. One is that these stability maintenance officials who come around are often in civilian dress and often unidentified, of unknown provenance. It is not clear who they are. Maybe they are officials in civilian. maybe they are hired thugs. One does not know. And the other regularity, another regularity, is that those who get taken on the raw edge by stability maintenance, they get beaten up physically. At home, in the streets, in confinement. Often very badly, often to serious damage. And that is not something that happens because there are one or two rotten eggs in the barrel. This is systemic, that people get beaten up. So these sophisticated leaders who present themselves as urbane, elegant statesmen to the world, they are still unavoidably, as dictators are, when all is said and done, dependent on mafia-style, thuggish brutality. Now, the official story about the regime is that the state has delivered economic progress and that it has done that thanks to having adequate power to maintain stability. China is a big and complex system and which has a history, horrible history of horrible disorder. There needs to be enough power in Beijing to prevent disorder. Only then can the state deliver progress and serve the people. Now that's the official story. And this is a plausible story. This is not a version to be brushed aside. Up to reform and opening up, as of 1978, 79, China had behind it more than a century of absolutely shocking disorder, destruction and suffering, including the Maoist period. So it's not an implausible story. And what I've tried to do, I think, in this book is to test that story, not to brush it aside, but to test it. And I have given, I think, that story, or at least I've tried to give that story the benefit of doubt, and not just to be polemical against it, but really to test it. And that test consists at its core of a description of the apparatus. This is the biggest bureaucratic system that has ever been invented. There are about 75 million people now in the pay of the state and the party. 75 million people. I mean, one of the real challenges for me in observing China is to get my head around the numbers. I mean, it's really difficult. And it's important. And certainly for some from myself, I mean, I come from Norway. This is one of the smallest countries in the world that's now, reached up to almost 5 million people. I mean, no matter what statistic you look at for China, 5 million, that's just the margin of error. I mean, to get my head around the numbers has been very difficult, and it's very important to be able to do that, because so much of the Chinese story is about this bigness. So, the state and the party have about 75 million people in their employ. That's more than the population of any European country. And I've tried to see how that system is made up and worked. The party system, the government system, the military, the legislature, the judiciary, the police, the administration, and so on. And I've looked at the economy, and I've looked at taxes, and I've looked at public services in some detail. And let me just mention some things that I've found as I've gone along. In administration, there's been a big shift in the last decades, where responsibility has been decentralized out of Beijing to the provinces and to local governments. Now, a local government in China is like a small European population, but never mind. So there's been a decentralization of responsibility. Now, much more of what the state does, it does through the local state. And people meet the state in the local state. So the local state has been given vast new responsibilities in the form of mandates from the center. You have to do this, that, and the other. So a big shift of decentralization of responsibility. But at the same time, there's been a centralization of power. So that the local units who have all these responsibilities are more, now at least in formal terms, agencies of the central state. They have big responsibilities that they have to exercise, but it's the central state who tells them what those responsibilities are. And this combination of decentralization and centralization we can see very clearly if we follow the flows of public finance. Much more of public spending is local, but much more of the tax revenues are central. So these local units who have responsibilities do not have the money. They are dependent on Beijing for the money, so Beijing holds the purse strings and is in control. I've looked very carefully at taxation in this book. There's a lot about the Chinese tax system here if you want to understand Chinese taxation. This is a really, and I know a lot of you are really interested in the question of Chinese taxation. I know that from social settings when I've tried to engage friends and others in a conversation about the Chinese tax system. I've seen the roller blinds go down. But it's interesting because if you want to understand a state, you must look at the taxes, the way it taxes. So I've looked at that. And what I found is that the Chinese live under a heavier tax burden than any other people on the surface of the earth. The tax burden on the Chinese is much heavier, for example, than the high tax Scandinavian welfare states. About 2/3 of the income, of national income in China, flows through the state in one way or another. 2/3. The tax burden is about 66, 67, 70%. Very heavy tax burden. This is a tax burden that no democratic system could maintain. It's a very heavy tax burden. And then when I look at public services, that is, what do the people get back in return for all the taxes that the state extracts from them? It's not very much. There's a lot of services, but compared to what the state takes in, what it gives back is not very much. So the state is running a business with a big profit. And it needs that big profit because its system is very, very expensive. It has to pay not only for its big bureaucracies, it has to pay for all the money and the income that leaks out of it through corruption, for example. It has to pay for the capital flight. Chinese people with money, they want to take it out of the country. There's a huge pressure for capital flight and a lot of money going out. That has to be paid in some way. And there has to be something left over when all this is done to reward the population with better standards of living. So it's a very expensive system to run. Now, I should then add about the tests that there's one more thing, and that in which maybe this work is a bit different from some others, and that is that I place a great emphasis on ideology. There is a view that with Deng Xiaoping and his pragmatic reforms, China became pragmatic and ideology was gone. I don't believe that at all. So I look very carefully at ideology. And I take ideology in this system very seriously, including Xi Jinping, the present leader's innovation, which he calls the China Dream. And I'll return to that also towards the end. Okay, now, then looking at all these things, this leads me to an assessment of state capacity. And that looks like this. First, state finances are rock solid. State finances are rock solid. Let me give a little bit of backdrop to that. After the Maoist disasters, the Chinese state was bankrupt. It didn't have money. It didn't even have enough money to fund its own military. So the military had to go into business, which it did in absolutely horrible ways. And Deng Xiaoping's reforms were geared to restituting the fiscal basis of the state. A state like the Chinese one cannot function if it doesn't have adequate funds. So Deng Xiaoping's program was to rescue the state by reconstituting its fiscal base, that it has enough money to work with. And that has succeeded in a rather dramatic way, so that state finances are now rock solid. There are lots of problems in state finances, but this is a system that has money to work with. Then I say, secondly, that the administrative capacity is adequate. It is effective, although never efficient. It is a very wasteful system, these huge bureaucracies. Money leaks out of them all over the place. They're ineffective. They do not work very effectively, very efficiently. So they get the job done, but not in a cost-effective manner. It's a very, very expensive system. So it's effective, but never efficient. That's true also of the military, for example, which looks much more impressive in numbers than it does in real military capacity, if one looks at it carefully. So administrative capacity is adequate, effective, but never efficient. And then control capacity is awesome. Control capacity is awesome. The party and its tentacles are everywhere, now including inside the new sector of private business and the new sector of non-government organizations, more or less non-governmental organizations which are growing up. There are, in business and in civil society, there are a lot of non-government actors, but the party is there, looking. And as strange as it may sound, and it's certainly strange for me, in a population of 1.4 billion people, the party knows everything and sees everything and hears everything. And they know those who are in opposition to it by name throughout the country. They really do know. And we can come back to some examples of how well they know in the discussion if you are interested, but they know ahead of time what is going to happen. Now, in this awesome control capacity, there is a pattern, or there are some patterns. Complex. It's difficult to get this right and describe it correctly. There's a lot going on. And a lot of people under this dictatorial regime get away with a lot, certainly in speech. You know, those of us who have visited and been for a while in China, we're surprised at how open and free the speech is. In universities, for example, I've spent much time in China and collaborating with colleagues there in Chinese universities, and we have discussions pretty much as we do here. It's pretty open. Even in writing, things are, there's so much going on. It's more difficult in writing, but there are some people who get away with a lot. And in this, we see a lot of arbitrariness. Sometimes people get away with being very critical without anything happening, even in writing. Some people get away with it. Others are cracked down upon for what seems to be entirely trivial things. It's difficult to understand exactly what's going on. I mean, one thing is that maybe the control system it's effective but not efficient, so maybe not all these control officials are totally on the job all the time. It's plausible. But also, perhaps, it is useful in a dictatorship that things are arbitrary, that people do not know and cannot know where the borderlines are, what is permitted, what is not, when there will be cracked down and when there will not be cracked down. Possible. It's possible to look at Chinese civil society today and see much of positive developments. The emergence of non-governmental organizations, although they are sometimes government-organized, non-government organizations, but still. There are charities, there's a lot of charity work. There's voluntarism, there's a lot going on in civil society. Chinese life is better regulated by law than it has been previously. Citizens can now sue government agencies, or at least some of them, and they do so. They're a quarrelsome lot. They use this opportunity to sue the government when they can, and sometimes the courts rule in their favor, and sometimes even the court rulings are implemented. However, the civil society that we from the outside are in touch with is first a tiny sector. It's not a big sector, a tiny sector, including, academic colleagues who engage internationally. They're not many. They are not big numbers, and they are under observation and under control in various ways. A colleague of mine, an American colleague, recently told the story. She had been in China at a Chinese university, collaborating with colleagues whom she knows very well, has been collaborating with over time, and all was as it usually is normal. And then one day, one of her colleagues comes to her and says in great joy that, "I'm not going to have to write that self-criticism after all." And she was absolutely flabbergasted. It's self-criticism, written self-criticism. That was what they were up to in the Maoist period. Well, no, it's there now. But we who are visitors do not see it. So it's difficult to describe this. It's not entirely black and white. It's a control system, but it doesn't control everything. It doesn't control or crack down on what doesn't need to be controlled. But there is in one way, it is not arbitrary. And there is one thing that is not allowed. And that is to form networks or organizations outside of the party system for whatever purpose. That is not allowed, and that gets cracked down upon. Now, I say the party system. That is a big affair. There's the party itself, which now has about 90 million members. And then there are all the affiliates, the All China Federation of Trade Unions and the All China Women's Federation and the Communist Youth League and the All China Student Organization and the All China this, that, and the other for journalists, lawyers, and whatnot. The All China Federation of Trade and Industries, which organizes the private units in the private sector, private business units. So it's the party and all its affiliates. And someone like myself, who is a statistically minded person, I want to know how big this is, so I try to count it up, I try to measure it. And I found, we don't know because the statistics are not precise, but you can get to a reasonably good guesstimate. And it turns out that more than half of the adult population is co-opted into some kind of membership in the party system, the party and its affiliates. And that's where organizational work is to happen, not outside of it. Not outside of it. It's not permitted. Let me give you an example. About a year ago, maybe a bit more, a number of women were rounded up for engaging in demonstrations of feminist inspiration in several cities and towns throughout the country. Some of them were held in confinement for a long time and mistreated quite badly. Many were rounded up. Now, what these women were demonstrating against was sexual harassment on public transport. Now, that is not a system subversive issue. Not even the People's Republic is dedicated to protecting the right to sexual harassment. And for example, the All China Federation of Women is entirely online in that issue. But what these women had done is that they organized. They had coordinated actions in different towns and cities across the country at the same time. And they were hauled in. And this was dramatic. After that, there has not been visibly any feminist action in China. Some of the women who had organized this have left the country. Others have given up. This was an absolutely clear signal from Beijing that that kind of organizational work is not going to happen. And not because the issue was subversive, but because it is subversive to organize for whatever reason outside of the party system. It was dramatic. It was not just that some few women were hauled in, but this was the end, for now, of feminist activism in the People's Republic. Okay, so state finances are solid, administrative capacity is adequate, control capacity is awesome. Dictatorship perfected, the controlocracy. Now, I think in the literature, the non-Chinese literature on Chinese politics and the Chinese state, there are two main interpretations with many variations. One is the more or less favorable interpretation that sees the Chinese regime as basically a benevolent autocracy that delivers good governance for its people. Okay, everyone is aware of the blemishes, it's all of that, it's dictatorship, it's hard now and then, but never mind. In the balance, in this interpretation, this is a relatively benevolent autocratic system that delivers good governance. And the other main interpretation, the critical one, is that this is a system riven by internal contradictions that cannot hold. The contradiction between Leninism in the political system and capitalism in the economic system, the contradiction between local and central authorities and so on, the contradiction between the different bureaucracies and all that. That it's riven by contradictions, and that somehow something will have to happen when these contradictions can no longer be contained. Now, many variations, but I think those are two main interpretations. And for my part, I reject both of those. First, I say this is not a benevolent autocracy. This is a hard, relentless, and unforgiving dictatorship, near to an all-out totalitarian state. So I don't buy that benevolent interpretation. But nor do I buy the contradiction interpretation. I do not see this as a system riven by internal contradictions. Many problems, many difficulties. But it's not that the different elements of the Chinese model tear against each other. Pretty much they are in harmony with one another. Pretty much. So that's what leads me to this bleak view that the hard dictatorship that we now have is the natural form of rule in the People's Republic. Now, the road to the controlocracy has been up and down. And let me just mention these, you know all this, but let me just mention some of the highlights anyway. The People's Republic, as we know, was established in 1949 when the communists won in the Civil War. And it then had a first period of about 10 years, which was progressive, at least in economic terms. Strong economic growth. Strong economic growth is not new to the People's Republic. It started with strong economic growth. Hard dictatorship under Mao, but the first period was progressive in economic terms. Then followed the 20 years of the Maoist disasters, which are horrendous to behold. The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1960, and then the Cultural Revolution, 1966, and 10 years on. You know, we think now that in the Great Leap Forward alone, those few years, cost us 40 million lives. We don't know, but in the Cultural Revolution, 5 million, 10 million lives, we don't know. I mean, I still find, you know, these are just the hard facts of history, but I still find it absolutely shocking to think of what happened in China in that period. Sort of deaths on a horrendous scale by design from above. Mao had become all-powerful, all power in the hands of one man, and the cost was death and destruction on an unprecedented scale. Then came, when Mao did the world the service of exiting, reform and opening up as of 1978 with Deng Xiaoping. And what I think is important to remember about reform and opening up was that it was, from the beginning, intended to be economic opening up, but not political opening up. Economic opening up and political reconstitution. And Deng Xiaoping was entirely clear about that himself. There was never any idea that it would be a comprehensive opening up in society. It was economic opening up for the purpose of reconstituting the fiscal basis of the state and fortifying the state. Then followed in 1989 the events that we associate with Tiananmen, which I describe as the uprising of 1989. A widespread national revolt against the system, which almost brought it down, and which was then cracked down upon, as we know, in the harshest way. We don't know how harsh. We don't know in how many towns and cities there were crackdowns of the kind we know from Beijing. We don't know how many lives were lost. But what we do know was that this was not a student demonstration in the center of Beijing. It was a popular uprising throughout all of Beijing and throughout the country. And it was cracked down upon in a way that said to the people that opening up outside of the economy is not available to you. You will not have it. Forget it. In 2012, the present leader, Xi Jinping, came to power and took the People's Republic into its third phase. And what we have seen during his first 5 years is a step-by-step concentration of power in the country to Beijing, in Beijing to the party, and in the party to the man himself. And a relentless step-by-step tightening of repression. And as we speak, we are in the middle of that shift. Xi Jinping has now been in charge for near to 5 years. He faces a party conference later in the year. He will probably be reappointed, re-elected for another 5 years. If that would not happen, it would be an earthquake. That's entirely unlikely that that would not happen, and his reign will continue. So we can now round off by some careful speculations about where this Xi Jinping shift in the regime is going. And we don't know, obviously. And I do not make any predictions, But I speculate about some scenarios in the end of this book, and I do allocate some probabilities to those scenarios, but I do not predict. I mean, a lot can happen. In my view, this is a system that is in firm control, but that control rests on many a fine balance, and things can go wrong for it. Things can go wrong for it. So my main scenario then is that there is a continuation of hard dictatorship, which is nevertheless tempered by an element of pragmatism. That element of pragmatism is what I try to describe about civil society. There's a lot going on. It's not absolutely black and white. It's not clear. And that, I think, is a high probability scenario, that pretty much things will continue as they now are, with the hard repression and attempts to continued economic growth. Now, the main alternative scenarios that I see to this is, first of all, chaos and breakdown. You see, I don't think there's any hope of opening up politically and socially from within the regime. And if its grip on control fails, then it seems to be that the result will be that China again falls back into chaos. I think I can say that with some authority, because one of the works I've done previously has been about the South Korean state, which remarkably transformed itself peacefully from an autocratic to a democratic system. And therefore, from that work, I and colleagues know something about the conditions for that kind of transition. And those conditions are not present in the Chinese case. We can come back to it in the discussion, but they are not. And the Chinese state is, the Chinese model is prone to chaos. And if the control breaks, then I would think the result would be chaos. Now, I hold that to be a low probability scenario. But it's possible. It could happen. I wouldn't put a lot of money on it, but it could happen. Another alternative interpretation, scenario, is a movement out to the all-out totalitarian state. Now, if we have sort of mild autocracy here and totalitarianism there, then under Xi Jinping, the Chinese system has been pulled in the direction of totalitarianism. It's not quite there yet, I think. But it's possible that that movement to all-out totalitarianism will continue. And what separates that all-out totalitarian scenario from my hard dictatorship scenario is ideology, the force of ideology. I'm very precise with what I mean by ideology in this discussion, not just some slogans about this, that, or the other, but ideology, as I discuss it, is a belief system of commanding force. In Xi Jinping's big transformation of the regime, I see also the embryo of a return to ideology. Now, obviously not Marxism-Leninism, which has no traction anymore, but now an ideology grounded in nationalism, chauvinism, and aggression, under his slogan of the China state. The China dream. Now, the China dream, from Xi Jinping's side could be just another slogan. The Chinese leaders are experts in the use of slogans of all kinds. Maybe it's just another slogan, maybe it's just hot air. But it could also take hold as ideology. And if it is taking hold as ideology, it is ideology of the most sinister kind. An ideology in which state and nation is everything and individuals are nothing. And we can go into this in the discussion, but that is the ideology that Xi Jinping has articulated as the China dream. A dream where the state and the nation counts for everything and individuals count for nothing. And therefore, the heading that I give to, and I hold this to be a second high probability scenario, that the shift towards totalitarianism continues. Not necessarily so, but it's high probability. And the heading I give to this final scenario in the discussion is the perfect fascist state. And with that, thank you for your attention.